terribly sorry. I don't know how I could have been so deceived.
Don't blame yourself, Miss Woodhouse. You've been so kind as always. It's just... Oh dear, and poor Mr. Elton.
I beg of you not to spare so much of a passing thought for him. He only wanted to enrich himself. There was no real affection in his language or manners.
Oh, this is my fault, Miss Woodhouse. I have no right to assume that a man of his standing would consider me a suitable match.
The fault is all mine. It was foolish and wrong to take so active a part in bringing any two people together. It was making light of what ought to be serious. I am quite ashamed and resolved to do such things no more. If you should like to stay, your usual room is made up.
Thank you, dear friend. You are so kind as always.
Emma, I have some news. Having run into Mr. Elton this afternoon, I agreed to convey a message to your father. It appears that Mr. Elton is to leave tomorrow morning on his way to Bath, where he has engaged to spend a few weeks.
I have some news for you in return. It appears Mrs. Weston's fears were justified. She and Mr. Weston received a letter from Frank Churchill, stating he cannot be spared and will not be coming to Highbury after all.
Well, very sad news indeed, though hardly surprising. It is to be hoped that Mrs. Weston is not too exceedingly disappointed. I dare say he might come if he would.
I do not know why you say so. He wishes exceedingly to come, but his aunt will not spare him.
If Frank Churchill had wanted to see his father, he would have contrived it.
We ought to be acquainted with Mrs. Churchill's temper before we pretend to decide what upon her nephew can do.
There is one thing which a man can always do, Emma, if he chooses, and that is his duty. It is Frank Churchill's duty to pay this attention to his father. He knows it to be so.
I wish you would try to understand what an amiable young man may feel in opposing those whom he's been looking up to all his life.
Our amiable young man is a very weak young man if he had no such resolution. I can allow for the fears of the child, but not of the man.
We shall never agree about him, but that's nothing extraordinary. His letters seem to satisfy everybody else.
Expect they do not satisfy Mrs. Weston. Had she been a person of consequence herself, he would have come, I dare say.
You seem determined to think ill of him.
Not at all. I should be as ready as any man to acknowledge his merits, only I hear of none, except that he is good-looking with plausible manners.
Well, then, it will be a treasure at Highbury. It's not often that we look upon fine young men, well-bred and agreeable. Can you imagine what a sensation his coming will produce?
You will excuse me being so much overpowered. It should not occupy much of my time or thoughts.
My idea of him is that he can adapt his conversation to suit everybody and has the ability of being universally agreeable.
And mine is that if he turn out anything like that, he shall be most insufferable. My dear Emma, your own good sense could not endure such a puppy when it came to the point.
I shall say no more about him. My love for Mr. and Mrs. Weston gives me a decided prejudice in his favour.
There is somebody I don't think of from 1 month's end to the next. Good day to you, Emma.
Good day, Mr. Knightley.
I have never been inside the home of Miss Bates before. Are you sure she will not object to my accompanying you?
Not at all. Miss Bates is always glad of an additional ear on which to inflict her stream of consciousness. And besides, it will do you good to think no more of Mr. Elton.
Mr. Elton, I had almost forgotten till you mentioned him.
Fortunately, she will be not receiving a letter from her niece for 3 days. I really have no desire to hear another word about Jane Fairfax.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, so good of you to come. And Miss Smith, you're most welcome. You must have heard the news, I suppose.
News?
Jane has come to visit. Isn't it wonderful? She should be so happy to see you. Please come in, take a seat. It's such wonderful, happy news, isn't it?
Oh yes, quite wonderful, Miss Bates.
Would you like some cake?
Yes, please.
Mrs. Cole's just in. You've only just missed her, more's the pity. Do you know, she came for 10 minutes and stayed an hour with us. She had a piece of cake and said she liked it very much. Do you know who's particularly partial to this cake?
No, who?
Mr. Elton.
It's such a surprise Jane has come to visit. I had feared I would hear little about Jane Fairfax today.
Yes, it's just unexpected, wonderful news. She's just gone for a stroll. She gets such bad headaches, you see. But I'm sure she'll be back presently. I do hope you'll stay long enough to see her. She would very much like to see you, I'm sure.
We can really stay but 10 minutes.
Of course, I understand, but she would really like to see you. Shall I tell you how it's come to be that she's come to visit? Would you like me to tell you?
Really, Miss Bates?
I'll tell you, dear. The case is, you see, the Campbells are going to Ireland. Jane has heard a great deal of its beauty from Mr. Dixon. She used to be often out walking with them. Mr. Dixon is a charming and amiable young man, I believe. Jane was quite longing to go to Ireland from his account of things.
You must feel it very fortunate that Jane can come to you at such a time, considering the friendship between her and Mr. Dixon.
Very true, but you see, everything turns out for the best. Ever since the service Mr. Dixon rendered Jane at Weymouth when they were out at the party on the water, and she would have been dashed into the sea had he not, with the greatest presence of mind, caught hold of her habit. Well, ever since we had the history of that day, I've been so fond of Mr. Dixon.
What a frightful story.
But one with a happy ending, I fancy.
So in spite of Jane's wish of seeing Ireland, she prefers devoting the time to yourself?
Entirely her own doing, and Colonel and Mrs. Campbell think she does quite right, as she's not been quite so well as usual lately.
I'm concerned to hear of it. Mr. Dixon's wife, I understand, has no remarkable degree of personal beauty, is not by any means to be compared with your Jane.
Oh no, there's no comparison between them. Mrs. Dixon always was absolutely plain, but extremely elegant and amiable.
Yes, of course.
Jane caught a bad cold as long ago as the 7th of November, a long time for a cold to hang upon her. She is so far from well that the Campbells think she'd better come home. Nobody could nurse her as we should do.
Well, it sounds to me like the most desirable arrangement in the world.
Oh, Jane dear, you're back. Look who's come to visit. You remember Miss Woodhouse? Isn't it nice of her to come and visit Jane?
Very nice indeed. How do you do?
Very well, thank you. May I introduce Harriet Smith? Harriet, this is Jane Fairfax.
Delighted to meet you.
Did you hear about the wedding of Mr. Weston and Miss Taylor? Now Mrs. Weston, of course.
I did indeed. I was very pleased for them.
They've been eager for Mr. Weston's son to visit, but alas, he's not been able thus far. I gather you and him were at Weymouth together. Did you know him?
I was acquainted with him.
What is he like? I'm so very curious. I've always had a very particular interest in Frank Churchill. Is he handsome?
I believe he reckoned a very fine young man.
Is he agreeable?
He was generally thought so.
Generally thought. Forgive me, Miss Fairfax, but I'd very much like to know what you thought. Did he appear a sensible young man of information?
I believe everybody found his manners quite pleasing.
I can see for the present that shall have to do. I'm sorry, Miss Bates, but we must be on our way. We must return to father.
Of course. It's so wonderful for you to visit. It's so good. Really good of you to come, isn't it, Jane?
Good day to you both.
A very pleasant evening, Emma. You gave us some good music. I'm sure Miss Fairfax must have found the evening pleasant. I was glad you made her play so much.
Miss Fairfax is very reserved.
My dear Emma, you are not going to tell me, I hope, that you had not a pleasant evening.
Oh no, I was glad with my own perseverance in asking questions, and amused to think how much little information I obtained. Most notably in regard to Mr. Frank Churchill, with whom she knows I have a particular interest. She is a closed book.
I am disappointed.
Well, I'm sure she's a sort of elegant creature that one cannot keep one's eyes from, as I'm sure you can attest, Mr. Knightley. Because our ages are the same, everyone's always assumed us to be so fond of each other, and I simply cannot warm to her.
Perhaps that is because you see in her the very accomplished young woman which you yourself wish to be thought.
I must bow to your better judgment in that regard. You watch her decidedly more closely and spellbound than I.
Emma, I have some news.
Oh, my dear sir. Good morning to you. Oh, my dear Miss Woodhouse. I come quite overpowered. Thank you for sending such a beautiful hindquarter of pork. Oh, I do so love good pork. Have you heard the news? Mr. Elton's going to be married.
The very news I was about to break to you myself.
But where could you hear it, Mr. Knightley? For it is not 5 minutes since I received Mrs. Cole's note. I'd just gone down to speak about the pork, for my mother was afraid she did not have a salting pan large enough. And just then the note came. And Miss Hawkins of Bath, that's all I know. But Mr. Knightley, how could you possibly have heard it?
I was with Mr. Cole an hour ago. He'd just received the letter as I was shown in and handed it to me directly.
Well, I suppose there was never a piece of news more generally interesting. So, Mr. Knightley, you actually saw the letter?
Yes, it was short. I forget the precise words, but the information was, as you state, that he's to be married to a Miss Hawkins of Bath.
Mr. Elton going to be married. He will have everyone's wishes for his happiness, I am sure.
A new neighbour for us all. I cannot bear to have the vicarage without a mistress. Miss Hawkins, I dare say, will be an excellent young woman. It's such a happiness when good people get together. I feel we're quite blessed in our neighbours.
And as to who this Miss Hawkins is, nothing, I suppose, can be known. One cannot think it's been a long acquaintance. He's only been gone 4 weeks.
I always rather fancied it would be some young lady hereabouts. But I do not think I am very quick at those sort of discoveries. I do not pretend to it. What is before me, I see. Miss Woodhouse lets me chatter on so good-humouredly. I believe I must be running away. This has been a most agreeable piece of news. Oh, Mr. Knightley's coming too. Would you be so kind as to give me your arm? Good morning.
What a very welcome piece of news. It proves, as I suspected, that Mr. Elton cannot have suffered long. But I do feel sorry for Harriet. Poor Harriet must feel it. All that I can hope is that I may deliver her the message myself, to save her hearing it abruptly from the others.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?
Oh dear.
I set off from Mrs. Goddard's half an hour ago, but then it began to rain and I did not know what to do, so I ran as fast as I could.
Harriet, calm yourself.
I'm sorry, Miss Woodhouse, but I simply must tell. So I ran as fast as I could and took shelter at Ford's, and there I had sat when all of a sudden who should come in but Miss Elizabeth Martin and her brother, Robert. I thought I should have fainted. Well, he looked round and recognised me, and they began whispering to one another. Presently she came forward and said she was sorry we never met now, which I thought almost too kind. And then, when you think, I found he was coming up towards me too, so he spoke and I answered, and then I took courage and said I must go. I had not got 3 yards from the door when he came after me, only to say he thought I'd much better go round by Mr. Cole's stables, for I should find the near way quite floated by this rain. I would rather anything than have it happen, and yet there was a sort of satisfaction in seeing him behave so pleasantly. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do talk to me and make me comfortable again.
It may have been distressing, but you seem to have handled it extremely well. And I must say so have they. But it is over now, and as far as a first meeting can go, it can never occur again. So you need not to worry about it.
Very true, I must not think about it. I'm quite sure this day cannot get any worse.
I fear that is not true, my dear Harriet, for I have some news.
News?
Yes, it concerns Mr. Elton.
Oh dear.
Ah, Miss Woodhouse, please allow me the pleasure of introducing you to my son, Mr. Frank Churchill.
Why, Mr. Churchill, it is an honour to meet you at last.
The honour, I'm quite sure, is all mine.
I told you yesterday he'd be here before the time mentioned. I must hurry. If you'll excuse me, I need a moment with your father.
Well, tell me, Mr. Churchill, what do you think of Randall's?
I like it very much. It is not nearly so small as I've been led to believe. And Highbury itself seems most agreeable, though I am, of course, yet to know it properly. I was hoping that you might be able to help in that regard, Miss Woodhouse, assuming you like walks, that is.
Well, I hope you'll be here quite long enough to know it better. How do you like Mrs. Weston?
I can scarcely express so much gratitude for the happiness that she has secured to my father, and for a very kind reception of myself. I must thank you for your part in making Mrs. Weston such a lady as one cannot help but have the warmest regard.
I protest she had far more to do with shaping my character than I hers.
I suspect your influence greater than you suppose. Agreeable manners I was prepared for, but I had not expected to find more than a tolerable-looking woman of a certain age. I did not expect to discover a pretty young woman in Mrs. Weston.
She would quarrel with you for using such words. Do not let her think that you've spoken of her as a pretty young woman.
I hope I should know better.
Oh, excuse me. I must hurry. I have business at the Crown and a great deal of errands to run for Mrs. Weston at Ford's. But let me not hurry anyone else. Please stay and become better acquainted.
As you are going on business, sir, I shall take the opportunity of paying a visit. I have no doubt that Miss Woodhouse and I shall have ample opportunities to become better known to one another. I have the honour of being acquainted with a neighbour of yours, a lady by the name of Miss Fairfax. Although Fairfax, I should say, is not the proper name. I believe rather Barnes or Bates.
To be sure, we know her, Miss Bay. And I remember you knew a Jane Fairfax. You knew her at Weymouth. And a fine girl she is. Call upon her by all means.
There is no need to call this morning. Another day would do as well.
Oh no, call today. What is right to be done cannot be done too soon. And if you do not call early, well then it'll be a slight.
I've heard her speak of the acquaintance. She's a very elegant young woman.
Yes.
Though I'm afraid you will not be able to engage her much, for she has an aunt who never holds her tongue.
Thank you for the warning. I look forward to meeting you again, Miss Woodhouse, and I trust it shall not be long before we do. You are quite the lady, and it's been quite the honour. Good morning.
Miss Woodhouse.
It seems to me O'Driscoll walks in every direction, but if left to me, I should always choose Highbury.
Alas, it is difficult for me to be as whimsical about settings I've seen so many times.
Oh look, the Crown Inn.
It was built as a ballroom, I gather, though I don't ever remember it being used as such. There doesn't seem the appetite for balls any longer in Highbury.
That is something we must change with the utmost urgency. I can see no obvious fault with the building. It would hold the very number for comfort.
There's a want for proper families in the place.
Am I really to believe that we could not furnish numbers enough for such an event? My mind is quite made up. We are to have a ball, Miss Woodhouse, and you and I shall dance.
Very well, I shall hold you to your word. We'll be passing the house of Miss Bates presently. Did you pay her your visit yesterday?
Ah, yes. I must thank you for your preparatory hint. If the talking aunt had taken me by surprise, it would have been the death of me. 10 minutes would have sufficed. But there was no getting away, and I found I'd been there nearly an hour before my father arrived.
And how did you find Miss Fairfax looking?
Oh, very ill. Miss Fairfax is always so pale as to always give the appearance of ill health. A most deplorable want of complexion.
I cannot agree at all. That's very ungracious of you. There is a delicacy in her skin which gives elegance to the character of her face.
Oh, perhaps, but nothing can make amends for the want of a fine glow of health. Where features were indifferent, a fine complexion gives beauty to them all.
Well, there's no disputing about taste. At least you admire her, except her complexion.
I cannot separate Miss Fairfax and her complexion.
Did you see her often at Weymouth? Were you often in the same society?
I met her frequently at Weymouth. I'd known the Campbells a little in town, and in Weymouth we're very much in the same set. Colonel Campbell is a very agreeable gentleman, and Mrs. Campbell a warm-hearted woman. I like them all.
And you know Miss Fairfax's situation in life, I conclude. What she's destined to be.
I believe I do. Did you ever hear her play?
I've heard her play every year of our lives. She plays charmingly.
She appears to me to play very well, but I know nothing of the matter myself. I remember once another gentleman, married to another woman, yet he would never ask his wife to sit down and play if Miss Fairfax could sit down instead. It raised a good many eyebrows.
Mr. Dixon is very musical, is he?
Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Dixon were the persons.
I've known Miss Fairfax from a child, but I could never attach myself to one so completely reserved.
It is a very frustrating quality, but no doubt often very convenient.
Intimacy between Miss Fairfax and me is quite out of the question. Such extreme cautiousness implies there's something to conceal.
I perfectly agree.
We think so much alike that I can hardly believe today is only our second meeting.
Come, Miss Woodhouse, will you show me the way to Ford's? I've heard all about Ford's, and in order to become a true citizen of Highbury, I am perfectly resolved to buy a pair of gloves.
You are already well received in Highbury, Mr. Churchill, but lay out half a guinea at Ford's and your popularity will doubtlessly increase tenfold. Come, it is this way. Here I see. It's arriving like you should do, like a gentleman.
How fortunate we should arrive at the same moment. Had you seen me first in the drawing room, I doubt you would have discerned me any more a gentleman than usual.
Yes, I'm sure I should. There is always a look of consciousness when people arrive in a way which they know to be beneath them. Now I shall be happy to walk into the same room with you.
Nonsensical girl.
A very good evening to you both. So delighted to have you with us.
Absolute pleasure. So sorry your father can't join us, Miss Woodhouse.
He sends his sincerest regards for thinking of him so thoughtfully, but regrets he is not well enough at present.
Well, we are so very grateful to have you attend. Please, come in. Have you heard the news about Miss Fairfax?
Now, dear, it does not do to gossip.
Oh, Miss Fairfax will not mind. She has been talking of it herself already. I called on Miss Bates today,
and no sooner had I entered the room than I was struck by the sight of a pianoforte. Oh, a most elegant-looking instrument, I do declare. It arrived yesterday, but to the great astonishment of both Miss Bates and Jane herself. But it was entirely unexpected, and she is quite bewildered to think who could possibly have ordered it.
Now, they're both quite satisfied that it only came from Colonel Campbell.
But Jane, it seems, had a letter from them very lately, and not a word was said about it. But they might choose to surprise her. Ah, Mr. Churchill.
Good evening, Miss Woodhouse.
Mr. Churchill, Mrs. Cole was just telling me about the surprise gift for Jane Fairfax.
It always has quite hurt me that Jane Fairfax should not have an instrument. Only yesterday I was ashamed to look at our new grand pianoforte in the drawing room, while I do not know one note from another. We are in great hopes that Miss Woodhouse may try it this evening.
I'm afraid my playing will sound positively wretched when compared with Miss Fairfax.
Oh, there's no need for modesty, Miss Woodhouse. Your playing is quite elegant. Do excuse me.
Why do you smile?
Nay, why do you? I smile because you smile.
I suppose I smile at Colonel Campbell's being so rich and liberal. It is a handsome present, and I much think that your idea on the subject is very much like mine.
I fear you give me greater credit for acuteness than I deserve. If Colonel Campbell cannot be the man, who can be?
What say you to Mr. Dixon?
Mr. Dixon? Yes, we were speaking yesterday of his being so warm an admirer of her performance.
Yes, and I suspect he had the misfortune of falling in love with Miss Fairfax. It must be a reason for them to come to Highbury. The arrival of this pianoforte is decisive with me. Depend upon it, it is a present from Mr. Dixon.
Your reasonings carry me along with them entirely. I can now see it as nothing else other than an offering of love.
Then we are once again in agreement.
I've been here a week tomorrow, nearly half my time, and yet I've hardly begun to enjoy myself.
What's the matter?
Oh, forgive me, but Miss Fairfax has done her hair in such an odd fashion that I cannot take my eyes from her. I wonder if it is an Irish fashion. I must go and ask her. Shall I?
No!
Yes, I declare I shall, and you shall see how she takes it.
This is the luxury of a large party. One can get near everybody. I've been making discoveries and forming plans just like yourself. Do you know how Miss Fairfax and Miss Bates arrived here this evening?
They walked, I conclude. How else could they have come?
Mr. Knightley's carriage brought them, and is to take them home again. I was very glad, but really quite surprised. Such a very kind and thoughtful attention.
I know no man more likely than Mr. Knightley to do something so considerate. I know he had horses today, for we arrived together, and I laughed at him about it.
You give him more credit for disinterested kindness in this instance than I, for a suspicion has darted into my head. In short, I have made a match between Mr. Knightley and Miss Fairfax. What do you say to it?
Jane Fairfax? Good God, you do not mean it. I cannot consent to Mr. Knightley's marrying.
She has always been a favourite with him, as you very well know.
But the imprudence of such a match.
I am not speaking of its prudence, merely its probability.
I see no probability in it. My dear Mrs. Weston, do not take to matchmaking. You do it very ill. Jane Fairfax, mistress of the Abbey? Oh no, I would not have him do so mad a thing.
Imprudent, if you please, but not mad. I see nothing unsuitable.
But Mr. Knightley does not want to marry.
But if he loves Jane Fairfax?
Nonsense. Mr. Knightley does not love Jane Fairfax in the way of love. I am sure he does not. Mr. Knightley does nothing mysteriously.
I have heard him lamenting her having no instrument repeatedly.
Very well, and if he'd intended to give her such a gift, he would have told her so.
There may be scruples of delicacy, my dear Emma.
My dear Mrs. Weston, you take up an idea and run away with it, as you've reproached me with doing.
I know not what you ladies are scheming about, but I fear it must wait. Something most pressing must be discussed.
Scheming? Us? The very idea. What is on your mind?
A ball. Such a ball as has not been seen in Highbury for many a long year. And you and I, Miss Woodhouse, shall have the first dance. Nay, the first two dances.
I'm not at all sure that Randall's is big enough for a ball.
I perfectly agree. Therefore, I bring a new proposal on the subject. May I hope for the honour of your hand, Miss Woodhouse, as for a ball to be given at the Crown Inn?
The Crown?
Yes, I've made inquiries and it is all perfectly possible. Is it not a fair exchange? Do say you will consent.
I think it admirable, and as far as I can answer for myself, I shall be most happy.
Splendid. We must convene tomorrow to make the arrangements. My dear Miss Fairfax, will you allow me to join you for a song at the pianoforte? I greatly wish to show off my voice.
Only if it be no imposition on your other guests.
Oh, I'm sure we should all love to hear you sing. And the pianoforte gets such little use from us.
Very well, if it pleases.
Does she not? And kind of a little perform on such an occasion.
Not the only kindness showed this evening. I gather you provided your carriage in service of Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax.
The least I could do, I'm sure.
The arrival of this pianoforte is very kindly given.
Yes, but surprises are foolish things. The pleasure is not enhanced, and the inconvenience is often considerable. I should have expected better judgment from Colonel Campbell.
Quite so.
That will do. Miss Fairfax has entertained us more than enough for one evening. We should not wish to impose further, I'm sure.
Oh, one more. It would not fatigue Miss Fairfax on any account.
I must insist, sir. Would you have a sing yourself hoarse? She's entertained us more than anyone has a right to ask.
Come, let us have this all cleared away, and then the dancing may commence.
I trust that I have secured the honour of a dancing partner.
If you are sure there are none other that you would rather ask.
Shall we?
Good morning, Mr. Churchill. I fear I've only just finished breakfast.
Yes, you must forgive the intrusion. I've received a letter. Mrs. Churchill is unwell. Far too unwell, it seems, to do without me. And she must entreat me to return to Enscombe without delay. Of all the horrid things, leave-taking is the worst.
But this will not be your only visit to Randalls. You will come here again.
The uncertainty when I shall be able to return. I shall try for it with a zeal. It shall be the object of all my thoughts and cares.
Our poor ball must be quite given up.
The ball. Why did we wait for anything? You told us it would be so. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, why must you always be so right?
Indeed, I am very sorry to be right in this instance. I would much rather have been merry than be wise.
If I am able to come again, do not forget your engagement.
The first 2 dances.
Such a fortnight as it has been. Each day more happy and more perfect than the day before. Oh, happy those that can remain at Highbury.
And are you to be off this very morning?
Yes, my father is to join me here, and then I must leave immediately. I'm almost afraid that every moment will bring him.
Not even time to visit your friends, Miss Fairfax and Miss Bates?
I have called there. It was the right thing to do. It was something to feel that all the rest of my time could be given to Hartfield. You look sullen.
I fear I am.
In which case, Miss Woodhouse, I feel that you can hardly be without suspicion that...
Frank! Oh, forgive the intrusion. Oh, Miss Woodhouse! I fear we must be leaving.
I've engaged Mrs. Weston to correspond with me. In her letters, I shall be in dear Highbury again.
Goodbye.
Rather, farewell, Miss Woodhouse.
Well, I suppose I must be a little in love with him. In spite of every previous determination against it, I certainly must. Everything being so listless and dull about the house, I must most certainly be in love. I should be the oddest creature in the world if I were not. Well, we shall have fellow mourners for the ball, if not for Frank Churchill. I wonder what Mr. Knightley should think.